Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jane Huckabee, and I'm the Director of the International Human Rights Clinic at Duke Law. And it's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the final event in our COVID-19 Advancing Rights and Justice During a Pandemic. The series has been co-convened by 4 organizations from Columbia Law School, the Columbia Law School Human Rights Institute, and the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law, the Duke International Human Rights Clinic, and Just Security. The series was really convened to provide a space to talk about the numerous human rights impacts associated with COVID-19, and to also provide a chance for dialogue on thinking through what a human rights compliant response would look like in the current context. We've had, throughout the series, 15 events. We've had over 20 co-sponsors and an extraordinary array of speakers addressing diverse topics. We've reached thousands of people globally, many of whom have engaged actively with the series through Twitter and through other modalities. All recordings of the events in this series are available through the website for the series, which is www.tinyurl/COVID-19 Justice Series. While today's event does bring to a close the spring version of our series, we will be taking suggestions for future events from students, from scholars, from practitioners, and consider resuming in the fall with the beginning of our academic year in September. So with that all said, I am very happy to be handing over now to my colleague, Larry Helfer at Duke Law, to moderate today's event. Thank you very much. And thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Jane. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this last event of the series on a very important topic. I'm Larry Helfer. As Professor Huckabee said, I am a professor at Duke Law. I co-direct the Center for International and Comparative Law here. And among my areas of research and advocacy over the last 2 to 3 decades has included the rights of Lgbti persons. And so I'm really delighted and honored. It's a privilege to moderate this panel today. The topic, as previously advertised, is COVID-19 and the human rights of Lgbti people. And this is obviously a tremendously important topic, largely because the challenges of the pandemic that we all face are especially acute for these communities whose human rights were already under threat or violated in many different parts of the world, including from state-sponsored and private violence to criminalization, to arbitrary arrest and detention, and discrimination, just to name a few of the relevant issues. And I'm really, truly delighted to have a interesting and diverse group of speakers to share their perspectives on this broad topic with you today. I will introduce them briefly in a moment. The format for our discussion will be that each panelist will speak for 7 minutes. And after we have concluded with the presentations, there will be a question and answer period. And I encourage all of you to submit your questions via the Zoom Q&A function or on Twitter at #COVID-19Justice, all one word, COVID-19Justice. So let me turn to introducing our panelists in the order of their presentation. First, Victor Madrigal-Borloz is the UN independent expert on the protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Next, Gloria Careaga, who's professor at UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Our third panelist is Danilo da Silva, who is the executive director of LAMBDA Mozambique. And our fourth panelist is Ymania Brown of the Pacific Human Rights Initiative and co-secretary general of the International Lesbian and Gay Association World. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Victor Madrigal-Borloz for his comments. And again, I encourage all of you, if you have questions, to send them via the Zoom Q&A or on Twitter. Victor, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, and allow me to thank Duke, Columbia, Harvard for putting together this panel. I'm also greatly honored to be sitting amongst what I consider to be great giants of the movement. Gloria, Ymania, Danilo are all powerhouses in their own right, whose work I greatly admire. So it's a great honor for me to be sitting among them today. You mentioned, Lawrence, the issue of a human rights approach that could be applicable to answering to the pandemic. And that gives me a very good leeway to describe a little bit the work that we've been trying to do from the mandate in relation to this issue. When the pandemic started, it became very obvious to me that this was a phenomenon that we would not have completely experienced in our lifetimes, even though, of course, we do have strong guidance from the management of situations of emergency and states of exception about what are the legal limits that guide measures taken to protect public health. That framework, the strong framework of necessity and legitimate objective and proportionality, is of course the point of departure that we took, but we knew that this was going to be entirely different, both in its global scope and also the fact that it actually affects a great part of the population of this planet. And so the mandate got itself into an active listening position, while at the same time very actively working with my colleagues, the system of special rapporteurs and independent experts of the United Nations. And very quickly, I'll try to provide you with an overview of the result of those two streams of work. On the one hand, the work of special procedures has provided guidance to states in relation to what we understand as a human rights-based approach for the response to the pandemic. And that has four elements. It needs to be a response that is non-discriminatory, meaning that both in its intent, but also in its impact, there needs to be diligent assessment as to whether persons are going to be either targeted or disproportionately affected by the measures. It needs to be participative. It needs to ensure that the persons from affected populations, communities, and groups are going to be part of the design of the measures, not only because of questions of democratic governance, but most importantly because we know that measures need to cater for the way that communities configure their dynamics and their day-to-day routines, otherwise they will not work. Third, they need to be empowered. All of the energy of empowerment of civil society needs to be used in relation to the response of the pandemic. And fourthly, and finally, they need to be measures that have accountability. That is to say that there needs to be a system that allows us to evaluate whether the measures are really designed or having the impact of protecting public health, or rather other objectives, which is what we know from our experience as human rights practitioners, that is often the case in states of exception. That's the thread of work of special procedures, generally working on the provision of states, advice to states in relation to a human rights-based approach. Now let me turn to what the mandate has been doing. As I said, I placed the mandate in a very active listening position, and I have participated over the last 10 weeks in probably over 20 multitudinary meetings. I have myself held 3 town hall meetings with participation with over 500 individuals coming from over 80 countries. The persons that are on this panel have participated in one way or another in providing input in many of those events. And what is it that we have learned? We've learned, I would say, 3 great lines of findings. The first one is, we know that this pandemic affects a great majority of the world population in some way or another. But we also know that LGBT persons come to suffer its impact from a situation of weakness because of systemic violence and particular exclusion from sectors of employment, health, housing, and education, to name only a few. How do you stay at home, which is one of the great measures to fight the pandemic, when you are in a situation of homelessness? How do you wash your hands constantly if you are among the 2 billion people that my colleague, the Special Rapporteur on Access to Water and Sanitation, esteems that don't have access to water? And we all know that LGBT populations, because of disproportionate and exclusion, are disproportionately represented in the ranks of the poor, the homeless, and in general, the persons having worse health outcomes. Second, I would convey to you that I am very concerned about the fact that I believe some states are using the pandemic as an excuse to attack LGBT persons or to withdraw rights that had been acquired by them. I am dismayed today to find out that Hungary has passed Article 33, infamous disposition that is actually withdrawing the possibility of legal recognition of gender identity to trans persons within legislation aimed at COVID-19, at response to COVID-19. I have already expressed to Hungary, I see no reason why this would have any sort of logical connection with a pandemic, in the context of which, if anything we have learned, is that trans people need legal recognition in order to have full access to the rights. So that's one example. We just saw, of course, others measures that have been taken under the aegis, and this is why I think the element of accountability is so important. And finally, we know that civil society has been working actively and incessantly to actually cover the voids left by states, from putting together food packages and hygienic packages to distribute to the population, to actually, at the global level, provide overviews and coordination, such as the one that is done by ILGA, the network to which Ymania is a Secretary General, or rapid response funds that have been created. Civil society is a global asset that needs to be recognized and valued. And in the context of LGBT, it's very clearly able to deliver very tangible results. They need to be brought in as part of the response to the pandemic. It's a must. All of this is embodied in what I consider to be a historic statement, which was signed by 96 special rapporteurs, independent experts, and regional commissioners from the Inter-American and European system, where all of these findings are actually encapsulated, and that constitutes, I believe, a strong statement to the effect that LGBT persons represent a meaningful proportion of people everywhere, and also people affected by the pandemic, and therefore they need to bring in the solutions. Thank you so much, Lawrence. I very much appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Victor. Let me turn things over now to Gloria Careaga.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this panel and to join with colleagues and friends who have been working so hard for so many years. I'm very glad to see them even by this remote situation. I wanted to have a panoramic perspective about what's happening in Latin America, because at this stage of the COVID-19, Latin America has shown big contrasts. It has become the world epicenter of the new coronavirus pandemic, and the main culprits are Brazil, Peru, and Mexico, which are among the 20 countries with the highest number of accumulated infections and deaths, and with rapidly growing numbers. Fortunately, the reality of the continent is very heterogeneous, and the problems of these countries are not frequent in most Latin American nations. Particularly, I want to mention the striking is the response that the populist governments of Mexico and Brazil had sought to minimize the epidemic and seek that their followers continue to support them regardless of their own health or that of others, maintaining contact with people and continuing with their visits all over the countries. At the same time, we have got examples where Costa Rica and Uruguay have managed to control the coronavirus and prevent the spread of the pandemic with the lowest incidence and mortality rates, and so far with the lowest death rates, where governments enacted the national health emergency promptly. Public shows were banned with the exhortation to stay home and perform activities remotely long before the epidemic became a problem. In this framework, the situation of LGBT people is extremely problematic in countries such as Brazil and Mexico, where the government has not only avoided attending to their needs, but the steps have been taken in the conquest of rights. While in Uruguay and Costa Rica, the development of public policies continues, and Costa Rica prepares to install equal marriage in the coming days. In an environment of high discrimination, the conditions to face the COVID-19 pandemic necessarily become very problematic for LGBT. Their daily survival has been characterized by the development of escape and refugee strategies to build safe spaces. The pandemic now leaves us in serious vulnerability, having to return to a family environment where we have not been accepted and where resources for development are in constant dispute. According to many different diagnoses on homophobia, it is the family spaces and family members who express different forms of violence that significantly affect our dignity, from silencing, discrediting, pointing out and sanctioning our ways of being, but also where the possibilities of fulfilling activities for personal development, whether educational or work, are affected. In this sense, the family space often becomes a place of dispute where we must fight and compete with others for a social place that give us the recognition we need, but also for our own space and the resources to comply with our own responsibilities and needs. At the same time, we have to think about those who have the resources to live alone today. They do not necessarily have the love of social supports they need. Away from their families and with friends in confinement, this distance of the group, friends, or own family that we have built necessarily has serious consequences for the safety and well-being of people who face discrimination. Likewise, the restricted health services available today turn out to be risk areas and lacking the necessary supplies to continue the treatments. And in many cases, it is necessary to consider the correspondence between the identity and their official documentation to guarantee the access to services. In economic terms, I want to show up that in these countries, access to paid work is not guaranteed for many LGBT people, much less the possibilities of promotion and career development. The job placements of LGBT people, despite the various initiatives developed to guarantee employment for different identities, has not been a sustained achievement. For many people, flexible work gave them the opportunity to avoid having to face homophobia in a closed environment, provided them with a good income and the enjoyment of their time. But in the face of the pandemic, they have been confronted with a condition of deep insecurity, no salary, no social security, and great uncertainty about maintaining or achieving a contract. Others started small and even medium-sized companies that are closing today. Still others in sex work today not only have not a job, but they have even lost their homes as they used to live in small hotels. We have even been affected too by the measures that have been implemented in countries such as Panama, Peru, and Colombia to define going out on the street by sex, which do not take in account the wide diversity of gender, reaffirming biological determinism and exposing non-binary people to prosecution and criminalization again. By imposing the rule of sex-gender-based segregation, we return to the alleged biological determinism of sexual dimorphisms, placing no-binary people in a non-place. Once again, subjected to risk and vulnerability as a result of the stigma and violence that trans and transvestite people face in their daily lives. Thus, these measures ignore the fact that it is precisely non-binary people who in many countries have certainly been violated or tortured before the end of the day. In a society with stark tendencies to individualism, the best response has come from the most vulnerable. Trans sex workers have organized themselves to bring food and shelter to their most disadvantaged companions. But most of the help has been limited to remote exchange for support or bringing information of where to reach the attendance of some needs. And now we have to start thinking, what are the possibilities for the exit of the confinement? In a not easy panorama where the organizations of defense of the LGBT rights will be deep weakened, and many people do not have the social security to start again. But in a moment that the world and our lives have changed, we need to emerge from this global crisis and ensure that we can build a new way of life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gloria. Really do appreciate your insights. Let me now turn to Danilo da Silva for his intervention. Danilo?
Good evening from Mozambique, Southern Africa, and thank you for the organizers for setting up this panel and bringing up this issue, which is quite relevant that we are going through. So I'll start my presentations and to say that the previous speakers have touched many of the issues that LGBT people are facing in this pandemic, and it's not new. I think it's a thing that goes across the world, and once again it proves that when a crisis emerges, the most vulnerable are the ones that suffer the most. We as LGBTQI people are the ones that are having feeling the greatest impact of this pandemic, not because we are LGBT people, but because the structural barriers that are out there that prevent us to be part of some of these relief programs that are being setting up. I'll start my my interventions talking about Yes, many things were said that that are happening to LGBT people around the world, and I think that the most difficult one is to be locked up in a homophobic household. This is no joke. For you to be in a household with your parents or with your caregivers that don't recognize you as a human being, it's beyond any type of torture that any human being can endure. But in other hand, we have also things that are happening, and as Victor touched, some of the states are using the COVID-19 as an excuse to crack down or to prosecute LGBT people, and on the pretense that they are enforcing the social distancing guidelines. We've seen this happening in my region. We've seen this happening in Uganda. We've seen this happening in Zambia, in Tanzania, and most of those countries that are criminalized, they still criminalize same-sex relationships and gender identities. LGBT peoples are not being able to leave their homes. And if they're not able to leave their homes, they cannot access the few, and I'll say this, very few services that are out there for them. We have to acknowledge that being an LGBT person in the global north and being an LGBT person in the global south is not the same. The safety nets are not there. So I'm not saying that our brothers and sisters in the global south are not suffering from this pandemic, but I'm saying that the horrible things that we've been receiving, the horrible reports that we've been receiving from across the continent, they are quite appalling. So you have countries that have these structural barriers that prevent LGBTI people from disclosing their sexual orientation and gender identity. And they're being abused, they're being violated. And these abuses and violations are being perpetrated by both private and state agencies, and even worse. For instance, only yesterday, our Uganda comrades were able to free our people from jail, because the Ugandan state has, as Victor has said previously, used the COVID-19 as a pretense to lock down LGBTI people who were seeking shelter. So can you imagine someone who doesn't have a home or doesn't have a family, or the family has disowned them and they are in a shelter, and then comes a state agent and lock them in a prison? So this is appalling. So we have to understand that there are human rights violations also that are being underreported, because some of the states have stated state emergencies, and during the state emergency, some of these human rights violations are not being able to be tackled with. So I think that the more insidious impact of this COVID in our region is being the loss of livelihood. Gloria touched some of those aspects, and I said that it's a thing that it goes across the world. LGBT people with small businesses, they're being forced to close down, leaving thousands of LGBTI people in small and medium businesses to their luck. So it's worth the remind that LGBT people, especially trans communities, and I'm glad we have here someone that feels and understands how trans communities are being affected from this pandemic. And most of our communities, especially poor ones, they are not coping well with this pandemic. Issues such as poverty, we have to address issues such as poverty. And one of the things that I'd like also to mention is that although there are some initiatives out there in the world, some initiatives to respond to this pandemic, the bureaucracy beyond that is preventing small organizations, grassroots organizations, to respond adequately to this pandemic. We are talking about people that are not, they don't have something to eat. I'm sitting here, I'm quite privileged to be sitting in my study and talking to you, but there are a lot of people out there that cannot afford a meal this evening. So I would like also to use this opportunity to our well-wishers out there, the people and the organizations that are putting resources to respond to this pandemic, that we need to be expedited, because we are talking about lives. All the NGO bureaucracy, okay, it's needed, but we have to be expedited. Another thing that is happening is that it's totally different if you're an activist from the global north and an activist from the global south. Everything these days has to go online. We are talking about countries that have problems to access internet. How are we going to continue our work through internet when we are struggling to access internet? Everything is going online. And to tell the truth, some of the initiatives that are out there, they're quite privileged. People will not access videos. People will not access webinars. People will not access what some of activists are putting out there as a way to continue the work, because accessing internet, it's problematic. For you to access internet, you have to have money to buy the data and to have the right devices to access what is putting out there. Another issue that it's affecting, especially the human rights defenders, apart from this internet, is that we have to shift and to change our work, because we are used to go out there and talk to our lawmakers. We are used to go out there to talk in our communities. How are we going to do that through internet? So most of the work is halted. It's not possible. There are some very good initiatives out there, but they're quite limited. I'm speaking from a country that has problems in access the internet. We just have like less than 4% of the population that has access to internet. So how are we going to keep continuing and doing our work out there that is to mobilize, synthesize, and educate people around sexual orientation and gender identity? I think that we need to address two main aspects. How are we going to continue to work and defend human rights in this COVID pandemic and post-COVID pandemic? Another thing is how we're going to address and reshape the interventions that we have as human rights defenders in order to be able to, as Victor said, empower, include, and enforce accountability out there. So I'll stop here, and I think that I would love to hear from other panelists and our participants as well.
Thank you very much, Danilo. Our final speaker is Ymania Brown, and we very much look forward to hearing her remarks. Ymania, you have the floor.
Thank you for that, Lawrence. Good evening, everyone, or good morning, or from the future. I'm in Brisbane at the moment, so it's 2:30 a.m. in the morning. I want to preface my presentation by saying that some of the things I'll be mentioning is a trigger warning. So it might be uncomfortable for you. So if you feel that I'm talking about things that remind you of your own pain and trauma, please just drop out, and then you can come back later, okay? Very briefly, look, a selfie snapshot of COVID-19 and how it affects LGBTI populations. For me, there's a violence to the visibility, right, for trans communities. You ask us to come out and be visible. We even have a Trans Day of Visibility that we celebrate every year. But in 2018, did you know that Transgender Europe's Trans Murder Monitoring Project reported 369 trans killed, murdered around the world? 369. And you want me to come out and say, hi, I'm a trans South African from Samoa, go and represent the international organizations I represent, knowing that there is someone out there that will take me away from my children and end my life. Hashtag real talk. And maybe the best way that I can explain it to kick this off is unpacking the Pacific conundrum of community rights versus human rights. Human rights, from my perspective as a Samoan Matai, is a somewhat selfish approach. It is about me and my rights as opposed to my family, my community, my village's rights, right? In my Samoan community, my ainga, my family, my parents couldn't care less about whether I want to wear a dress or act in the manner of a woman. All my family care about is, am I okay? Am I safe? And what am I bringing to the table for the betterment of my community? That's as basic as you get, right? Now, is this the right approach? It's one of many approaches. We have something to offer, and definitely there needs to be room made at the human rights diaspora for other indigenous and traditional practices from the global south that support the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we talk about social justice a lot, right? And social justice for me is about intersectional approaches to ensure that there is equality for all, to ensure that there is access for all. And as you've heard from Danilo and Gloria, woefully inadequate in the global south, right? And we want to ensure that there is a world that is truly free and equal, as the UN has been campaigning for. It's about linking common struggles to find commonalities, to lend support, to weave voices, to make a stronger push for social justice. And not one sector can do it alone, not the LGBTI people. We cannot do it alone. We must band together in order to advance. And we are not, as has been said many times, we are not single issue people living single issue lives. So here's some examples for states that are pushing the boundaries of justice to further erode the limited human rights for LGBTI citizens during COVID-19. Danilo has spoken so eloquently about the Ugandan police. They raided an LGBTI homeless shelter in Kampala and arrested a number of residents for violating social distancing rules. They were jailed for 50 days and recently, they've been released. Belize police arrested and beat up an HIV positive man who later died. For what? For violating a curfew. The Philippines police publicly humiliated 3 LGBTI people plus others, forcing them to dance and kiss each other in public and videoed. In Hungary, they've recently introduced a bill to ban transgender people from legally changing their gender in their country. Morocco is going through campaigns of outing LGBTI citizens, resulting in their being ostracized by families, kicked out of homes with limited access to resources during the lockdown. These are devastating effects for stay-at-home restrictions, especially on LGBTI youth who are confined in hostile environments with unsupported family members and or roommates, and the rise of the religious right adding condemnation for LGBTI people. And what do these show? What do all of these this angst against LGBTI during COVID-19 show? That decriminalization is important, but it's only a beginning, a crucial beginning, because it opens doors. But I caution, there is a massive difference between the legal equality and the lived equality of LGBTI citizens. Massive, huge. So check out the ILGA World research publication. I'll send the links over to the organizers, and you can see the state-sponsored homophobia report, and also ILGA Europe recently released its Rainbow Europe report, which reviews human rights situation for LGBTI people in European countries. And if you need data for your research papers, the data is out there. Just get in touch with those organizations. The second part that I wanted to talk about is the role that the UN can play in advancing action for support for LGBTI citizens during COVID-19. First of all, the UN experts issued a recent joint statement. Awesome start. Thank you, Victor, for spearheading that campaign. And it is so heartwarming. And like most of us just cried when we saw that. It was like, this is a long time coming. So thank you. We also need to look at finding a way to enforce a legal obligation on members who do sign up to adhere to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and then flagrantly act against its articles and principles. Currently, it's not. But it should be. And yes, you have your UPR processes and your independent experts, and we have our own SOGI independent expert. You have your UN treaty bodies and mechanisms, but why? Why in 2020 are my people still dying? Because of who they love and how they self-identify and the way they were born. Why? Our oppression is a continuous cycle of repression. And it's time for the UN and the Human Rights Council to grow up and flex its considerable diplomacy muscles and affect real change fast. Because we on the ground, you've heard from Gloria, you've heard from Danilo, we on the ground have had enough pain, enough tears, enough death, enough violence and discrimination. Trans women being hunted in streets in Latin America and Europe, publicly flogged in Asian countries, killed everywhere. LGBTI populations forced into barbaric and inhumane conversion therapies. No, no, no. You know, the UN Declaration of Human Rights states that each one of those states must guarantee equal rights under their laws and freedom from discrimination for all individuals in a society. And that's my dream. That's your dream. That's our dream. But it's a freaking nightmare at the moment. Please, right? The last part I wanted to talk about is resources. And you've heard from Danilo and Gloria and Victor, right? There needs to be more resources and funding. You cannot do anything. You cannot fight COVID-19 and limit resources, right? You're talking about flattening the curve to infection. We've been fighting for decades to flatten the curve of discrimination and violence, right? Advancing social justice with little to no resources. I mean, Gloria and Danilo are examples of the resilience of LGBTI people doing so much with so little. The Global Philanthropy Project, right? Links will be submitted to the organizers. Their snapshot of funding for LGBTI issues in its 2016 reports, the GPP reported foundation funding for LGBTI issues is 17 cents per $100 of funding. Imagine what we could do with $1 of every $100 of funding. Government funding in 2016 was 4 cents per $100 of LGBTIQ funding. Imagine if we could do with 50 cents of every $100. There are phenomenal organizations out there. The Global Interfaith Network in South Africa, the International Trans Fund, the Intersex Fund, to name a few. We need more funding. Really, there is no excuse to not fund incredible work done by international LGBTI organizations around the world, especially in the Global South, so that activists such as Danilo and Gloria and myself and thousands more do not have to fight for social justice with both hands and feet tied, both eyes taped over in a darkened room. And that's my intervention. Thank you so much for the time, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ymania, for the very detailed and really impassioned plea that you have made to everyone. We have had a number of different interventions, questions from the audience, and just remind you that please submit them via the Q&A function on Zoom or via Twitter, hashtag COVID-19 Justice. Let me get started by combining two of the questions that we received. The two relate to both two aspects of some of the challenges of the pandemic for the LGBTI community. So the first relates to fact-finding. Given the challenges of accessing communities during the pandemic, to find out information on the ground, how is fact-finding changing? How are we learning about the kinds of violations that are ongoing that Ymania and others mentioned? How can we do more to find out what we don't know in this regard? So how has fact-finding changed? What suggestions do you have for any of the panelists along those lines? And then combining that with the assistance that researchers might be able to provide. So what kind of research and data needs would support the work of LGBTI civil society groups or other groups that are in collaboration with them to address these issues? So what kind of information would you want to have to further bolster and support the work that all of the panelists are doing? So maybe Victor, I'll invite you to say a few words at first about that, if you do, and then if any of the other panelists, since there are only 4 of us, probably just let me know that you'd like to make an intervention, or just go ahead and make it. They're just the 5 of us, so please.
Thank you, Lawrence. And I'm sure that there will be a variety of opinions around the screen with the very, very experienced colleagues that we have. Let me start though by expressing my admiration for Ymania, because I did not quite realize that it's 2:30 in the morning in Brisbane, and I am just absolutely flabbergasted that she's still looking as fresh as she is. I know it's also late for Danilo, but Ymania, I think, takes the record. So, fact-finding and evidence. I had the possibility to work on this, on the report that I presented to the Human Rights Council last year on the whole issue of data and evidence. Allow me to share with you three main findings, which undoubtedly are things, each of which would be a symposium in itself. The first one is that there is a phenomenon of negation in very many countries and contexts around the world. It is very often, a lot more often than one would suppose, where political leaders and mid-level bureaucrats around the world are working very actively to erase LGBT existences out of the picture. And this goes from the very, very high political dialogue, where the message would be, for example, what the Minister of Justice of Russia said publicly on the record at the UPR. He said, "We've looked for the gays and we cannot find them." This was a literal expression. That's a political statement of negation of the existence of LGTB persons. And then you have negation all throughout, including, for example, mid-level bureaucrats that refuse to include questions relating to these issues in data gathering exercises, such as the census, for example. And we've seen that happening all over the world. I think the other thing that I need to mention in relation to this is there where the existence of LGTB persons is accepted, stigma has penetrated very deeply into the structures, and that tendency to constantly question the need, for example, to obtain disaggregated data is something that all organizations and activists and LGTB persons are fighting against. So what is the alternative that is being implemented in very many countries? And I'll give you the example of Latin America, where data is being gathered by civil society. But of course, it's being gathered with the limitation that civil society works within. Ymania has made a very clear case in relation to that. What does that mean? Well, data is gathered with limitations in terms of geography, where where the NGO works, data is gathered. There where it doesn't work, of course, it cannot be. And then it depends on flows of funding that sometimes just stop. And then it's very difficult to obtain data that will continue in time in a way that is meaningful. Finally, criminalization is a terrible obstacle for data gathering, because how do you ask people about their lives when there is such a strong state-sponsored statement about their lives being considered not only disordered in some way, but actually antisocial? And I think that this is obviously a big, big hindrance. The last trend that I will mention in relation to this is that there are very significant asymmetries in relation to the evidence that is gathered in the global north and the evidence that is gathered in the global south. Allow me to give you a very specific example. I just completed a report on conversion therapy. It will be coming out very soon, within the next few days. And for that report, I carried out a literature review, and I will pretty much communicate that 98% of the literature concentrated on the global north and was produced in English, with notable exceptions in Latin America, where some literature has been produced in Spanish and so on and so forth. In other regions of the world, you just had a huge vacuum of information. And what this means is that the studies in which public policies get founded are therefore then produced within understandings of dynamics that are global north specific, which means that very, very often they fall off the mark in relation to the real dynamics of communities, peoples, and populations in the global south. So all of these are dynamics that we need to study and make sure that we work within them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victor. Do any of our, we have quite a growing queue of questions. Do any of our other panelists want to address either the fact-finding point or the type of research and data needs that would support your work?
Very quickly, just very quickly. One, when we talk about capacity building for NGOs in Global South, there needs to be an element of research based, for that. Because all we're doing is we're building organizational capacity, but we're not building the research capacity. We need our own people to do our own research. We are tired of people coming from the global north and poking at our lives and pulling it apart. Then they get all that data, they write their theses, they get their letters, and they fly away. And we're sitting there with nothing, right? So we're tired of that. Like, come on, if you need to enable us, build our capacity for research. When we write research proposals, you say, oh, but it doesn't fit in with our aims and objectives. Come on now. Come on now. You know, there are capable people, Black and people of color, who can do their own research. Engage them. Pay them what they're worth. That's so important. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you.
I just build on that. I just wanted to build on that. And thank you, Ymania, for touching that about extractive research that the Global South has suffered for a long time, which we've been fighting also for a long time. I think that evidence gathering is key to our interventions. If we don't get evidence, we will not be able to shift policies. And if we don't get evidence from the right people, with the right people involved, we also be doing more damaging, more harm than good. And I totally agree with you, and I totally agree with Victor. We need to support evidence gathering in the Global South, done by Global South people who understand the context that they're operating in. But I also want to touch another thing, which, as we're talking about social justice, and one of my intervention was about the differences between being an activist in the Global North and being an activist in the Global South. I don't want people to confuse or misquote me on that. What I'm saying is that in the Global South, you don't have the same safety nets that you have in the Global North. The states and the state institutions are not as stronger as they are in the Global North. They will not come to you if you're in the Global South. Some of them, these institutions are dysfunction, and you don't have the protective entities and measures that will enable you to continuously do your work as a human rights defender. So I think it's quite important that we touch these things. How are we going to move forward? And this COVID-19 has exposed so many differences, has exposed how so many inequalities in this world, even in our sector. So I think it's a good opportunity that we are having this discussion.
Thank you, Danilo, and thank you, Ymania. The second set of questions I'd like to raise here go to the question of building alliances among different groups. Ymania, you mentioned the common struggles, and finding commonality is very important for achieving social justice. We can't do it alone. And also the way in which there are commonalities about communities that are in need, whether it is a loss of livelihood to small businesses, or inequality, or poverty, or lack of internet access. And so I'm wondering, and maybe I'll just initially, it's again to all the panelists, but maybe I'll first, Gloria, ask either of you, are you seeing any connections among different advocacy movements or civil society groups in Latin America? So one question that I have been wondering myself is whether some of the evangelical movements, the church-based movements that are concerned with poverty and the well-being of humanity, whether there's some way to make common cause there, or whether that's simply outside the scope given the kind of push for the gender ideology movement that they have been pushing recently. So Gloria, maybe you could address the question of alliances and intersectional connections among civil society and what you've seen that might be positive, if you have some examples going forward, please.
Well, I think that most of the traditional linkages that we have built on in Latin America has been the feminist movement with the LGBT movement. We have been working together for many, many years in different ways. It depends on the countries, but most of the region are very much linked. In the last years, maybe in the last 10 years, we have broader linkages with the indigenous and with the Afro-descendant movement. So we have built on this big umbrella in which we have very interesting discussions, even with the sexual workers, with the network of sexual workers. And I think that it has been very enriching, not only for the work that the advocacy work that we're doing, but for a new way of thinking in each one of the movements. But as I see in the last 20 years, maybe, the evangelicals has been a very big obstacles for our rights, especially in Uganda. Danilo can say about it, but in Latin America, the increase, not only in Latin America, I think that this is a global situation. The increase of the right-wing and conservative governments have made very strong linkages with these religious groups, and it has been a real threat for our rights. And I think that this is something that we have been working on from the Sexuality Policy Watch, about trying to find out what is happening in each country in Latin America and how these groups are really fighting against the advancement of our rights. I think that this is a specific issue that we have been working with, and there's a big network in Latin America that are watching on what's happening on it.
Any other members of the panelists care to comment on this? We might have time for one more question.
I want to add to what Gloria said, that there's two ways to look at this. There needs to be an actual truthful decolonization from global North organizations, right? When they're dealing with global South, they need to truly decolonize their thinking processes, their organizational process, so that, you know, we can actually sit down in a table and have a fruitful discussion. The second part is the challenge to the LGBTI movement itself. We need to be united. And I say united in this fight. We cannot fight this alone. The trans community cannot do this alone. The gays cannot do this alone. The lesbians cannot do this alone. We are together. We need to present a united front to be able to do this. And it's really important, because I know as a trans woman, everywhere I walk in and there are TERFs, I turn around, and because I know that I'm going to be shamed and kicked out or, you know, thrown out. So for me, unity is absolutely important, and the decolonization work that's continuing now needs to continue, so it's more meaningful.
Thank you. We're nearly out of time, but I wanted to raise one other question that I think might be relevant to the kinds of cross-border issues that we're thinking about. So in terms of questions of individual security and safety and so forth, one of the ways in which, particularly if, as Danilo was saying, one's home life is adversely affected by the pandemic as an out person, or the different ways in which we've heard some countries have done much better on these issues, perhaps, than others. I'm wondering if any member of the panel has seen any change in the way restrictions at the national level on the processing of asylum claims for LGBTI persons has been occurring. Is that something, I don't know, Victor, that I saw that in the statement. I only looked at it very quickly, but I wondered whether that is something that is worth really focusing on. And also, Ymania, from your perspective in particular, I know those issues have been quite important in different parts of the world. So as to any member of the panel, maybe Victor, again, do you want to start? And then we can do this, will be our last question.
Actually, Lawrence, if that's all right, I see that Ymania had...
Of course.
No, I said that it was covered in the statement, you know, the issue of asylum.
It was covered in the statement. Okay,
it
good.
was, and I wanted Victor to maybe just elaborate a little bit on that. That was what I was going to say.
Well, thank you very much. I very much appreciate it. It is touched upon, but I think at the moment what we know is that this follows the trend of more of a general trend that we are seeing, and with my colleague, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Migrants, we are very concerned about, which is basically the use again of COVID-19 as a measure that will at some point go beyond the protection of public health exclusively and actually go on to the enforcement of other purposes within migration policy, which I believe is a real threat, and where, as we know, it's a generality of the persons on the move that will be affected. But as we know, within that population, there are certain peoples, persons, communities that will be impacted in a disproportionate way.
I think we may have...
To what extent are we addressing this? And we will continue taking a look at that. But to me, the key, Lawrence, will be the constant assessment as to whether the measure continues to be reasonably grounded on the protection of public health, or it has become a proxy for enforcement of migration policies that otherwise have not been achieved.
Thank you. Well, we are unfortunately out of time, and I will certainly pass along the questions that you've received. I'll pass them along to the panelists. I think we've had a number of very important and enlightening perspectives on a variety of issues. And I think if there were one overarching idea that the panelists' interventions might leave you with, is that we have two different kinds of challenges, at least many more. But one are the types of measures that target LGBT individuals in Uganda, in Hungary, in Belize, in the Philippines, as we heard about. And the other is questions of disparate impact of individuals where the policy itself on its face is not intended to at least overtly restrict the rights of LGBT persons, but in fact, in practice, has greater harm to one or more members of those communities. And I think both of those are going to be equally important in thinking through questions of fact-finding and data gathering, in thinking through the different strategies for advocacy, both within the communities and across with broader alliances. And so obviously this is a conversation that is going to continue, and I urge all of you who are interested in it to continue to follow the work of all of our panelists and their activities in the future. So please, I know you'll join me in thanking all of the panelists for taking the time and for their insights and thoughts. And just to remind you that a recording and closed captioning of this event will be available on the website of the series, which is tinyurl/COVID Justice Series. So I wish all of you the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Danilo. Thanks, Gloria. Thanks, Victor.
Thanks, Victor. Thanks, Gloria. Thanks, Lauren.
Great to see you all.